Welcome everybody, Shiur number 616. We're learning today Le'iloi Nishmas Moshe Doiv ben Rabban Zisel Le'iloi Nishmas Blima Bas Rab Moshe. Okay, Be'ezras Hashem, we want to start our new malacha, quite a number of new malachas, but we want to start out with KOSHAIR and mater. We're going to start with KOSHAIR, tying, and all the halachas that pertain to tying knots. Now, alternately on the other day, we're going to get into the malacha of tofer, which is sewing, tofer and kareya, sewing and tearing, and KOSHAIR umater, which is tying knots and untying knots. But we'll see as we go down the line. First, we want to start with the positive, then we'll work on the negative part, and we'll go from there. But before we start, there's just one more item. We're finished with the malacha of dash, which was the mefarik and the squeezing and all that, and seveya, the coloring and the dyeing. We're basically done in the meantime with those two malachas. Just one more quick thing I do want to mention, which we're not going to get into at all, and everybody should, talk to their local Rav about it if they have such an issue. And just real quickly to read from the Sefer Lamites Malachas, page 356, in reference to regular nursing a baby and so on. So says he brings on just in the English section to read it real quickly. Nursing an infant on Shabbos, of course, is allowed if the child feeds directly from the mother. Of course, that's the normal way. But however, the problem which does come up in reference to dash mefarek, when one has to pump out milk into a bottle or into a container to save for later on, to save for later use, is running into a problem of mefarek, a tolda of dash, and sometimes could be aser min haTorah. Now, of course, it goes without saying there are various situations. Sometimes a child has to have it like that. A child is sick. Sometimes the mother has pain, or whatever the case is. I just want to real quickly just mention that in all these various different cases, obviously there are ways to do it, ways to go about it, and everybody should, be in touch with their Rav, with their own Rabbanim, and, getting into the exact details. Obviously, there's all various different types of cases, various different types of levels, so we're not going to even begin to discuss the various different cases on the shiur. But I just did want to bring it up that people should be aware of, having to put milk, having to squeeze out milk and have it pump out milk, putting it into a bottle, a cup, and so on, is running into issues. But again, there are ways to work with it. There are ways to get around it, obviously, for cases of illness, pain, and so on. All right. So everybody has to, consult with their local rabbanon if it applies to them. Okay, moving to our new malacha of KOSHAIR, tying and untying knots. So I just want to start out with, as we always do, we always go through the beginning foundation of each malacha as to where it was found in the Mishkan, and thereby seeing what exactly took place and having a basic understanding as to what took place in the Mishkan, and from there moving down to the practical applications and see where the connection lies. So before we do that, I just want to, since our other malacha, which we will be starting Bezras Hashem, is tofer, sewing. So again, we're starting with KOSHAIR, tying knots, and tying in general, tying knots. We'll see other things also, and tofer, sewing. But the question comes up now as to what exactly is the difference between tying something together or sewing something together, or at least a halachic difference. So I want to read from the Sefer Lamites Malachas. He explains it so beautiful on page 784, the distinction between KOSHAIR, tying, and tofer, sewing. So he starts out, does the Sefer Lamites Malachas, that the malachas of KOSHAIR and tofer, again, tying and sewing, appear to be conceptually similar because they both entail combining two separate items. And when we tie two things together, everybody knows, in general, to tie two things together means to connect two items together. When we sew two things together, it also means to connect two things together. So where does the difference lie? But he explains further, however, they are not identical in principle. The two malachas entail two separate and distinguishable concepts in combining. So he explains, first of all, tofer, the sewing part, the halachic status of sewing, which is actually one of the Lamites Malachas, entails fusing two separate items into a single new entity. Again, it's fusing, making two items, and we taking two separate items and fusing it somehow, which we'll see how. We're going to talk about that, and making it into one single item, by which the original separate identity, in other words, from each item is now lost. You have, in other words, like this. I have two items, and I want to make them into one item, and by fusing them together, in which case each separate item, the identity of each one when it was separate, will now be lost. Whether this is accomplished by, and he explains, sewing, right, which is teifer, was regular sewing, gluing, we're going to see gluing together also is part of teifer, or stapling two items together is also part of teifer sewing. And now to undo something that was fused together in reference to teifer, sewing, or gluing, or stapling, however we're going to see as we get into it, to undo the fusing which was made it into one, would require an act of tearing, in which case we're going to be talking about the malacha of kaireya, tearing, which is basically the separation of two items which were fused together. And it's actually tearing that would change the character of the two items that were together. Now, we're going to see that tearing also sometimes applies to one item. We have to see and talk about it, how, what, when, and where it's going to apply in each case separately. Just as the original combining changed the character of each of the separate entities by forming a single new entity, the tearing part, separating them, again, takes away the single identity and now makes it into two. Good. So that's teifer, that's sewing. Now, what's kosher? What is sewing? What is tying? What is that all about? So in the case of kosher tying, he says further that two separate items are bound in a manner that does not cause the identity of each separate item to diminish. In other words, they're tied together. Yeah, they're connected together, but you could see them separately. They're two separate items that are just connected, but they still retain each one separately their own identity. So therefore, this way maybe. I just to give an example, I think about it sometimes. Interesting way of looking at it. Sometimes you look at a subway, for example. It sounds funny, but a train, a subway. The cars are all connected. The train is moving. You have 8 cars or whatever it is. They're all connected. They're all moving. But each car has its own identity. Each car has its own separate people, its own separate thing, its own separate. Everything is separate about that one car. And it's just attached in the middle by a lock or whatever it is that's holding the two together. So it's something along those lines, which is by, again, the same thing. You attach two items through a knot, through binding them together through a knot, but each separate item retains its own identity, whereas by teifer it's fused and becomes into one. Now, the tying together, whereby it becomes you're attaching the two items together, but they still remain separately identified. This may be accomplished. He goes further, explaining this may be accomplished by tying or twining two ropes or strings together, which we're going to see how that works. In either case, the ropes may be untied or unraveled, and we're going to see again how that works, and eventually made to appear exactly as they were before the knot or the twine was actually formed. In other words, they never lost anything. They just got attached, and now they're getting detached. That's it. Whereas before, two items became one, and now when you tear it, they're becoming back two. By kosher, by tying, they were always two items. They were just attached and detached, but they still remained two items. By teifer sewing, they became two into one. Okay, we're going to stop here, but that's basically this is the concept of the two malachas that we're going to be starting. Bezras Hashem, kosher tying and teifer sewing. So just real quickly to sum it all up in one sentence, that kosher is taking two items, tying them together, attaching them, but they still remain separately identified, whereas teifer sewing is taking two items and attaching them to the point that they become one. Okay, thank you for listening. Hatzlacha and bracha, kol tov.